C'est qui? Qui? C'est Kikina Studio.
Hello everyone, welcome to this new episode of JINS podcast, the very first podcast that tackles love, sexuality, feminism, and gender intertwined with Arab and or Muslim identities. JINS is first and foremost here to explore the areas that have been falling into the trap of taboo, haram, and munkar. Whatever the term or the language we use, sexuality has been put into the box of what is wrong with us people, especially after the Western civilization frowned upon the civilizations of the people they colonized. Then it became impossible to explore the psychology of female desire. Blame it on psychology and medicine. Most Muslim scholars across the continents wouldn't help either with their constant misinterpretations of the Holy Quran, while they should have drawn from it and the Hadith the many advice that would constitute an art of seduction and lovemaking. Because yes, Islam is a sexually enlightened religion, which teaches that sensuality should not be devoid of spirituality. It will probably raise a few eyebrows with the prudes amongst us, but Muslims need a compendium of the science and art of lovemaking from traditional Muslim sources. So what is the secret to female pleasure? Do Muslims have their own guide to passionate lovemaking and sexual compatibility? Can Islam still brag about its tradition of erotology? Does it change anything sexually to be Black, Arab, North African, or Brazilian if we are Muslims? To answer these questions, I am very excited to introduce Habeeb AKANDE. Habeeb AKANDE is a British-born writer, sexologist, historian of Nigerian or more precisely Yoruba descent. He is an alumnus of al-Azhar University in Egypt and Kingston University in the UK. He is the author of 7 published books on race and sex in African and Muslim cultures. Habeeb's work has gained momentum with a best-selling trilogy, A Taste of Honey, Women of Desire, and Kunyaza. His main research interests include women's sexual rights, eroticism, and the female orgasm in Islam and African cultures. As a public speaker and sex educator, Habeeb carries out workshops on the clitoris and on female ejaculation at international conferences and leading universities. He featured in the BBC documentary The Orgasm Gap in 2020, which explored teaching female pleasure in Rwanda and the UK. Taking this knowledge from prophetic wisdom, Habeeb AKANDE has explored every avenue of the subject with extensive reference to the great Islamic scholastic tradition. Dear Habeeb, thank you for accepting my invitation.
Thank you for the invitation.
You're very well known today as a sex educator, as a researcher on female sexuality. You combine your knowledge of erotic Muslim literature, African sexual techniques, Arab erotology. And so let's go one by one. First, sexuality and erotology in Islam. Can you tell us more about this? And does a proper erotology really exist within the Muslim world? Did it come with the modern times, or did it exist before? And would it be fair to say that Muslims have their own kind of Kama Sutra?
Wow. Very, very good and important questions. I've tried to unpack each and every one of those. So first, I think we should let me define what I mean by erotology. So erotology is a study of sexual desire and the act of lovemaking. And it's basically a predecessor of modern day sexology, which sexology involves a study of human sexuality, whereas erotology is a study of human sexuality plus the study of sexual ethics. And that's one of the main differences between erotology and sexology. Whereas sexology is really, like I said, studying human sexuality. Erotology doesn't just study human sexuality, but also gives, you could say, an opinion or a moral opinion or moral judgment in some cases. Now, there are erotology, like I said, it predates Islam. So, for example, the Kama Sutra, which is a well-known book about sex. It's not just about sex positions. That is a book about Hindu erotology. It's a book about sex, intimacy, relations from a Hindu perspective. Likewise, within the Islamic or Arab Muslim tradition, there were a number of Arabic-speaking Muslim writers, scholars, poets who wrote about erotology. Well, unfortunately, following the colonization of much of the Muslim world and Arab world, where a number of Arabic-speaking Muslims and Christians, they adopted you could say, a Victorian British or Victorian European understanding about sex and sexuality, where sex became seen to be something that is dirty, is nasty, is something that's just for men, and even sex became a taboo as well as female pleasure. So that's why now in many Muslim countries and the Arabic-speaking world, sex is a taboo, to the point where people no longer even speak about sex within their families, or there's not many books written by scholars or intellectuals about sex and the intricacies and importance of intimacy, and especially female sexuality. So in answer to your question, yes, the study of erotology, or the subject of erotology, predates influence from the Europeans. It was something that was prevalent in both the Arab world and the Muslim world from the 9th century up until the 19th century. But it was really the heyday, you can say, of erotology was between the 9th century and the 14th century, where you had a number of intellectuals and even religious scholars, such as Imam al-Suyuti, who was a scholar from modern day Egypt, but he was originally from Persia as well. He wrote over 20 books about erotology, about sex, desire, and a lot of his books would shock many modern day Muslims who have adopted a very prudish attitude towards sex and intimacy. So he spoke not only about sex, but also the importance of women's pleasure and importance of female sexuality. And whilst I was studying in Egypt, after I graduated from university, when I was studying in al-Azhar, I came across a number of books in local bookshops where they were speaking about, erotology. And I thought, wow, this would be really interesting to not only to translate and bring to light to the English speaking world, because I thought this was known amongst a lot of the Arabs at the time, and even amongst a lot of the Egyptians, they wasn't familiar with this, because a lot of them, when I mentioned this, they'll say, no, this is aib, this is haram, why are you talking about this? But when I mentioned there's a number of scholars, like I mentioned, scholars that they respect and they regard, who spoke about these topics, many of them weren't aware of this. And some of them were aware, but because of their understanding of sex nowadays is something which is taboo, they felt uncomfortable to talk about it. So especially in relation to the importance of female sexuality, because we hear a lot about the importance of women satisfying their husbands, but we don't hear much about the importance of men satisfying women, and also some of the issues that women go through. So that's why I wanted to revive and speak about this tradition. That's
great. And were there any stories of sexually empowered women in Islam?
Wow, very, very good question. There's many stories, and that was something that in my recently published book, Women of Desire, I listed about 40 sexually empowered women in Islamic and in Islamic history. Now, for example, one of these women, a really empowered woman, was called Hubba al-Madaniya. She was a sex advisor, an intimacy expert, you can say a relationship counselor as well, in 8th century Medina. So she lived during the time of the companions of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. So she was known to give advice to both men and women. Some of the men, like there's one particular story where her son, so she remarried, and her son, who was middle-aged at that time, he was upset that his mother remarried Hubba. She remarried another man, and she made like a funny remark, an anecdote, saying that, like this, you don't want your mother to be desired. Well, this man, he gives me more pleasure than like a donkey, kind of thing. So she was a very outspoken woman. She was a woman who, like I said, even the elites and the scholars at the time, they knew who she was, and they even wrote stories and poems about her. And like I said, she taught both men and women. So this is when a lot of Muslims look back in, like the sacred period, or the the greatest period in Islamic history, and they generally refer to the first 3 generations, you had women that were teaching men and women about sex and intimacy and the importance of men satisfying women, and even how women can be empowered and learn about their body and learn how to enjoy physical pleasure. So yeah, she's one of many people of an example of a sexually empowered woman in Islamic history.
That's very interesting. Now, you talked also a lot about African sexual techniques, sexuality within the Black communities around the globe, and also about a mysterious word for me, which is kunyaza. So can you please tell us more about the African art of intimacy, and what does kunyaza mean exactly?
Sure. So kunyaza, it refers to an ancient African technique which has the reputation of helping women experience multiple orgasms and squirt, or female ejaculation. So basically, kunyaza is a technique that refers to, like I said, a man being able to help his wife experience orgasms and female ejaculation. Now, the technique itself, it's been around for hundreds of years. Some say up as far back as the 16th century. And the origin of this kunyaza technique was, again, this is how the story goes, that there was a queen in Rwanda who she was yearning for some special attention. She was yearning for a husband who was currently away on a military expedition. So she summoned one of the guards to come and make love to her. Now, the guard at this time, he was, worried because he was worried about the repercussions if the king found out that he was laying with his wife. And as he came towards her, he started to tremble and shake as he was holding his manhood. The queen said, she summoned him. She said, I need you to make love to me. And as he made his way towards her in her bedroom, he kept on shaking, and it is said that his penis struck against her clitoris, and from there a large gush of fluid emanated from her loins, and it was said there that the Lake Kivu, which is one of the grandest and biggest lakes in Africa, was formed. Now, after the queen, experienced this wonderful orgasm and gushing pleasure, when the king came back, she then told the king, this is how I want you to make love to me. This is how I want you to satisfy me. It's not just about penetrative intercourse. Now, from there, the kunyaza tradition was born. So the tapping technique, which the guard used, that is known as the kunyaza, and the flow, the ejaculate, the water that comes from the woman, that is known as kunyara. So that's the difference between the two. Now, in terms of the story itself, it's probably a fable, it's a legend. But what is really interesting about this story is that it's a story that centers women's pleasure. It talks about women in a sense that they're entitled to pleasure, and the onus is on the man to ensure that his wife or his female partner is satisfied in the bedroom. So since that story was, has been told many hundreds of years ago, it's been taught from generation to generation, where women teach young women prior to marriage, and men also teach young men about the importance of women's satisfaction, about the female anatomy, and the different ways to bring and help a woman experience not only sexual climax, but also female ejaculation with the kunyaza tradition. It's also practiced in other parts of Africa, like even Southern Africa, like Zimbabwe, in parts of Nigeria now. And now, because of a documentary that was made about kunyaza, it's now even practiced in places such as Germany and even as far as Brazil.
So it's basically what Cardi B today calls a WAP, right? A wet ass pussy, isn't it?
Yes. So it's what's quite funny is that with Cardi B's song, and even with the Western world's, you could say, obsession with squirting and things like that, there's traditions, like I said, like in Rwanda, where traditionally this was the norm, to the point where if a man wasn't able to help his wife experience the water, he was shamed. Now, I'm not saying it's good that men are shamed, but in the Western world, generally, women are shamed for not being able to satisfy their male partners. Whereas in some other parts, like in Rwanda, the onus is on men to ensure that their female partners are satisfied. And also, in addition to that, women feel entitled to pleasure, which I think is just as important. If anything, female pleasure is prioritized over male pleasure. And again, although the technique is brilliant, and it's important that women's pleasure is considered to be the focal point of the sexual encounter, ultimately it's about mutual pleasure. It's about the man being able to satisfy his partner and her being able to satisfy him. So it's not just about women's pleasure and the man's pleasure is ignored. But a lot of people forget the importance of making sure that the woman feels safe and comfortable or before you enact this Kunyaza technique. It's not that you just go to a woman and you just start doing the tapping technique. She has to feel emotionally safe. She needs to feel physically secure, and she needs to feel comfortable in order to experience the Kunyaza.
One thing I wanted to ask you about is the orgasm gap, right? Can you try and define the orgasm gap for us and tell us why it is still a big issue today, especially in Muslim communities, and how can we close the gap?
Sure. So the orgasm gap refers to the discrepancy in orgasm between men and women. So one of the largest studies found that men orgasm 95% of the time when they're having sex. In comparison, women only orgasm 65% of the time. So that discrepancy or that difference between how frequently a man orgasms compared to women, that is known as the orgasm gap. So one of the issues, there are a number of reasons behind this, but one of probably the biggest issues behind the orgasm gap is a lack of knowledge about female sexuality and the female anatomy, and a lack of clitoral stimulation. So especially in the Western world and even much of the Muslim world nowadays, there's a lot of emphasis on penetrative intercourse. So for a lot of men, or a lot of couples, sex is just about penetrative intercourse. When most women, only about 30% of women orgasm via penetrative intercourse alone. So a lot of women, if not most women, need clitoral stimulation in order to reach orgasm. But because of the sexual script that a lot of people have learned and heard from the Western world, whether it's movies, whether it's books, whether it's what they've heard from their friends, like I said, it's all about penetrative intercourse. And a lot of times, a lot of women are not fulfilled because, like I said, most women do not experience an orgasm via penetrative intercourse alone. They need clitoral stimulation as well. So that's why it's important that men are taught other ways of helping a woman experience an orgasm. And this is by the man needs to be educated about the female anatomy. The woman herself needs to be educated about her own body. And then obviously the man needs to be less selfish in the bedroom and understand that there's different ways of helping a woman experience a climax. So that's why there's a lot of miseducation that people have both in the Muslim world, Arabic speaking world, that need to know about the female anatomy, female sexuality, in order so we can close this orgasm gap so women can climax just as frequently as men.
In terms of intimacy and sexuality, is there a way we can portray Black, white, and brown women's sexual satisfaction? Is there a differentiation we can make, or?
That's a very, very good question. In terms of, it'd be very difficult to answer, and I'll tell you the reason why. Sexual satisfaction is a subjective matter. As in what? Because if you were to say orgasm, then I might be able to answer it a certain way. But if you were to say sexual satisfaction, what someone finds to be satisfying is different to someone else. Because sexual satisfaction is not the same as an orgasm. Because someone can be satisfied without experiencing the climax. So in order for someone to be satisfied, their expectations need to be met. In parts of the Western world, or large parts of the Western world, a lot of people have sex, but not a lot of people are sexually satisfied. In the Arab world and in Africa, I would argue that more people are probably more sexually satisfied because the expectation isn't as high as what we are bombarded with in the Western world. If you have unrealistic expectations about sex because of what you've seen in porn, because what you've heard in the movies, how it's supposed to be, 2 hours, 3 hours, you're supposed to have all of these positions, you're supposed to be gushing and having all of these squirting scenes in the bedroom. Because of these unrealistic expectations that many people have, even when they have sex, it's not satisfying because they've got unrealistic expectations. Whereas someone who might be having less quote unquote adventurous sex, but they're satisfied with the sex that they're having, their sex is going to be more pleasurable. And I would argue that, like I said, I wouldn't say white women have less satisfying sex than Black women, because there are white, brown, and other women in the Western world. So I would definitely say in the Western world, it's a problem where I would argue that Western women probably have least sexually satisfying sex than maybe women in parts of the Arabian world and in Africa. And the reason being, it's not that the women in Africa and in parts of Asia are better at sex. I'm not saying that. I think they have more realistic expectations. Those who understand their body, I would say. Because like I said, even the most so-called liberated women in the Western world, or the women that's having so much sex, a lot of them complain about a lack of orgasm, a lack of feeling connected with their spouse, a lack of being able to emotionally connect, a lack of being able to feel emotionally secure. And that's because the culture that they've been brought up in is that sex is primarily for the man, and they're not been able to open up and speak openly and honestly about their sexual desires and things like that. That's why you find a lot of people in the West are they're chasing a new sexual high like kink and all of these other things, whereas it's not as prevalent in parts of in Arabic speaking countries and much of Africa. So it's a very good question, but I wouldn't answer it by saying, by color, but maybe by culture. So I would definitely say maybe by culturally speaking, I would argue that maybe in the Western world, people are less sexually satisfied than they are in other parts of the world.
I myself don't want to take the risk of being reductive or offensive to a special type of color or people, or to essentialize them, they're not all conditioned to act like this or like that, right? But during season 1, I touched upon that I have discussed with many experts the ways white people treat Black women as sexy panthers, and Black men were seen as walking penises, and all the main misconceptions about Blackness and those of African descent in sexuality. So there are sex-related stereotypes that are still way too much engraved in people's minds. How do we erase them?
Okay, the first part of my answer might sound quite controversial, but I'll say it anyway. Some people might not want those sexual stereotypes to be erased, and I'll tell you the reason why. So even when you mentioned, yes, and it's correct, that there are a number of people, for example, Black men are fetishized because the stereotype is that Black men have a large penis, right? Some Black men, if not a lot of Black men, not all, of course, do not have no issue with that, with being fetishized that way. And if anything, you can benefit from that, because then maybe more women want to sleep with you, whether it's true or not. But more women are now interested in you, are desirous of you. And if you're a man that wants to partake in those relationships, then you've got a natural advantage in the so-called sexual capital, if that makes sense. If you do not want to be seen that way, and maybe you feel that you're under pressure because, a woman is expecting you to be, wonderful in bed and X, Y, and Z, then for you, then you don't like being fetishized that way. Now, when we're speaking about Black women, I would agree. I think that a number, if not most Black women, do not like being fetishized the way they are, as being hypersexual, as they're being like these video vixens that they're always up for it, because it has disastrous consequences to them. As in, there's people that may desire them for sex, but not for intimacy and not for love. When if a woman wants love, she wants companionship, she wants commitment, but a man is only seeing her as in she's only good for sex, then of course she wouldn't like that. So that's why those type of stereotypes, rightly so, need to be dismantled. Like I said, if someone doesn't want to get rid of a stereotype, some people are, if anything, perpetuating it intentionally, in like you see in the music, in the films, perpetuating this stereotype because they somewhat benefit from it. And again, it's who's controlling the power. So in the Western world, and a lot of the conversations I think is coming from the Western world, it's the white person's gaze. So this is an issue in the Western world because it's the white person's gaze. So there are even a number of white men, they're not homosexual, but they fetishize Black men who think that they're really good in bed, and they want to even pay some Black men to sleep with their female partners because of what they've been programmed or what they've learned. So a lot of this education needs to be done because it's really an issue in some people's eyes and minds, not necessarily others. So a lot of Black men who may be fetishized, they may not see themselves like that way, but they know other people see themselves that way. So again, the education that needs to be done is who are those people that are fetishizing who, and then they need to be educated more than anything. Because generally, when you look at someone who's the other, who is different, you try to see some characteristics of what makes them different to you, and then either you can celebrate it or you can demonize it. And this goes back to, even if you look at the story of Sarah Baartman from the 16th century, when the Europeans, when they took her from South Africa, because of her physical shape, her buttocks were it was just larger than the average white woman, but how it was described is abnormal.
Yeah.
Because her genitalia, her lips was considered to be generally longer than the average white European woman, it was again considered to be abnormal. Now, in South Africa, where she's from, her body shape, her genitalia was normal, but in Western Europe, it's abnormal because it's different from what they're used to. And like I said, when you've got someone who's different, you can either look at it and maybe celebrate or just realize that's something that's unique in them, or you can look at it and demonize. And that's unfortunately what a lot of white people and Westerners have done, not only with African people, but also when a lot of Europeans came into contact with a lot of the Muslims and Arabs in like from the 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th century. They did exactly the same thing, where the Muslims were looked at as being very hedonistic, all about sex and lust, when that wasn't always the case. It's just that they were from a period where they were extremely prudish and they were in the dark ages. So in comparison to them, the Arabs and the Muslims of that time, they were just full of lust. And now, in a way, it's gone the opposite way, where the Muslims have become very prudish, and anything to relation towards sex is aib, or is fitna, or is haram. Again, and the reason why I say this is because when I spent some time in Egypt, it was like the opposite, that they will say everyone in the West, they're just sleeping with each other.
Yeah.
The women have got no shame. And it's just a very exaggerated version of what their norms are. So anywhere where you are, you've got cultural norms and understandings of what is acceptable and unacceptable. Then if anyone is slightly outside of that, they will naturally be seen as somewhat deviant.
Okay. And is there a way also for women who've been unfortunately excised to feel sexual pleasure or even kunyaza?
Okay, I'm glad you asked that question again. So I'm going to answer the question, but the short and long of it, if a woman has been circumcised or experienced FGM, she can experience pleasure and she can orgasm, if not just as much as a woman who hasn't experienced FGM or been circumcised. Now, I'm not an advocate for FGM. Okay, the World Health Organization, let me first define what they define FGM is. They say it refers to any part of the external female genitalia which is cut or removed for non-medical reasons. And they list it into 4 types. So basically any part of the external female genitalia, whether it's the clitoral hood, whether it's the clitoral glands, whether it's the labia minora, which is the inner vulvar lips, whether it's the labia majora, the outer labia lips, any part of that which is cut off, they consider it to be FGM if it's for non-medical reasons. Now, and then obviously there's some statistics that say over 200 million women and girls have been experienced FGM, and majority of them are in Africa and some parts of the Middle East. But it's important to realize or to understand is that when a Western woman undergoes labiaplasty or undergoes clitoral hoodectomy, where part of her hood is removed for aesthetic reasons, because she thinks that it'll make her vulva or vagina more beautiful, that's not considered to be FGM. Now, my question is, why is that? And a lot of these women, I'm not condoning it, I'm saying a lot of women undergo labiaplasty so some women who then inner lips are quite long, so they cut it because they want it to be tucked in and resemble what they call a Barbie doll vagina. They consider that to be cosmetic surgery. So when a Western woman or Western girl undergoes these FGM, female genital cutting practices, it's called female genital cosmetic surgery. If a woman, I'm not talking about a girl, in fact a woman, if a woman, an African woman or Asian woman undergoes a similar procedure in the Arab world or in Africa, it's called FGM. Now, my question is, why is that? And then people are labeled as being not only mutilated, but you can't experience pleasure. Now, I spoke to one woman, funny enough, yesterday, a Nigerian woman who has been circumcised, and she's also a sex educator. And she was saying that because of these false belief systems that exercise women cannot orgasm, when she obviously got married, she believed that. So if you've got this belief system that you can't orgasm because you've been circumcised or you've undergone FGM, then it's going to be very difficult for you to orgasm. So that's why even part of the education, what we're talking about, people need to be re-educated, even some Western sex educators and academics and researchers, because if you're giving the impression that women cannot orgasm, it may be difficult because, again, there's some women because of the trauma and this and the other. But if you take away the hope that because a woman has undergone some of these practices that they cannot experience pleasure, that they can't reach the 7th heaven and things like that, you're doing a disservice to a lot of these women. people think that I'm endorsing or advocating FGM, and I'm not. I'm just first want to highlight the hypocrisy in the Western world where with some of these female genital cutting practices, and again, understanding what is the difference, because in some parts, for example, in East Africa, the FGM practice that is quite popular is where the lips are removed and the clitoral glands, and then the vulvar lips are cut up, are sewn together in fibrillation. This is like the most horrendous and barbaric form of FGM. I'm totally obviously against that. Then there's other forms of what they consider to be FGM, where it's the clitoral hood, which is removed. Now, even when the clitoral hood is removed, interestingly enough, so a lot of women, and I'm not trying to make this a biology lesson, a lot of women, there's about 22% of women suffer from a condition known as clitoral phimosis. And this is basically where the clitoral hood is stuck to the clitoral glands. And even when a woman's aroused, because naturally when a woman's aroused, the clitoral hood will retract. So it's easier for the clitoral glands, the clitoris, to be stimulated and for her to be, reach orgasm and experience more pleasure. Now, if a woman suffers from clitoral phimosis or clitoral adhesions, and the clitoral hood becomes stuck to the clitoral glands, even if she's aroused, it's going to be stuck and she won't be stimulated. And for a lot of these women, it's even harder to reach an orgasm. Now, in the West, what they say is, you should undergo maybe a surgery known as clitoral hood reduction, where they cut off some parts of the clitoral hood in order to make it more visible, the clitoral glands, so the woman can experience more pleasure. And they talk about the benefits of clitoral hood reduction: easier to orgasm, more intense stimulation, X, Y, and Z. This same you can say procedure is practiced in part of West Africa, where they call it female circumcision. But when the West see it, they call it FGM. Is when Muslims are talking about Islamic female circumcision, that's what it refers to. It refers to taking a slight portion of the clitoral hood, not the clitoris. And even unfortunately, there are a number of translations of historic or Arabic texts where it's referred to what you're removing, if you're going to remove anything, it's the clitoral hood, it's not the clitoris. Now, again, because even some men do not understand the difference between the clitoral hood and the clitoris, I've even read some translations where they said, cut off the vagina. It's like, what? Do you understand? So this is where education needs to be had, both from the male side and the female side, and then you can distinguish. And they said, if you want to do that, it's not that it's, some Muslims consider it to be obligatory, but even understanding what are they talking about when they're speaking about female circumcision. It's not cutting off the labial lips. It's not cutting off the clitoris. It's not cutting off the clitoris. And those women who have undergone FGM or female circumcision, even when the clitoral glands has been removed, which generally people refer to clitoral glands as the clitoris, most of a woman's clitoris remains in her body. It's internal. So even if her clitoral glands has been removed, she still can orgasm because the clitoris sits inside and beneath the vulva, beneath the labia. Can a woman who's been exercised experience pleasure? Of course she can, because the clitoris is still there.
Can we also talk about sexual consent in Muslim communities? Because in countries like Morocco today, where I'm from, marital rape is not even forbidden by law, right? It's something that is very inscribed in law. The very fact of being married with someone is seen as the basis of consent, which is obviously paving the way for sexual abuse. We all know that consent should be taken more seriously by men who feel entitled to having sex. What should be done to ensure any sexual acts is consented and doesn't turn into rape, basically?
Yeah, I think a lot of education needs to be done. And you kind of answered the question where you mentioned that a lot of men feel entitled to sex. Now, the unfortunate thing is, and this is where, again, because it's about understanding legality and morality and ethics. So because when a man marries a woman, there's like an implied consent in that. So because you've got that implied consent, some men misunderstand and think they're entitled to that woman, to their wife's body anytime and every time that they like, and it doesn't mean that. And some people, unfortunately, even misuse or misinterpret certain prophetic traditions, as if they give them permission to sleep with their wife whenever they like, even if she doesn't want to, and that's not correct. Now, from an Islamic perspective, it's haram, it's forbidden for a man to force himself on his wife. Marital rape is haram. But because you can say the expression or the phrase marital rape is something that was only recently spoken about in the last 100 years or so. That's why a lot of Muslims will be like, it doesn't exist, because it's very difficult in a court of law to talk about that, because in a man's eyes, it's like, well, she didn't say no, but did she say yes? That's the question. Now, what needs to be done is that men need to be told and be taught that even your wife, you do not own her. Yes, you do have permission by the will of Allah to have sexual relations with her, but it doesn't mean you can have sexual relations with her at any time, that even if she doesn't want to. So consent has to be mandatory, but it has to be taught in a way where it's part of sexual ethics as well, because it's difficult to prove marital rape within a marriage, right? But in terms of even men having, it shouldn't even be even in your frame of reference that you'd even want to do that to a woman. And if anything, as you can say you're the guardian, you're the protector, but you don't own her. But she's not your property. But a lot of men, unfortunately, they feel that their wives is my property. I can do with her what I will, and it's not that. So there's an understanding that even with your child, you don't own them fully. Like there's a certain expectations and behavior that you're supposed to conduct yourself with, and likewise with your wife. Now, unfortunately, when we're speaking, and this is something that a lot of men do not understand, not only the importance of sexual consent and understanding what consent is, but also the importance of making sure that the woman feels safe in the bedroom. There are a lot of women that have sex with their husbands under duress, under a feeling where they don't want to, but they feel they're obliged to. They feel that they're doing out of duty. And this is something which, again, it's uncomfortable conversations that a lot of Muslims and a lot of men do not want to have, because in their idea or their understanding, of course, I'm a good man because I've got X number of children, I've had sex X amount of times. But how many times has that woman felt at ease, has felt pleasures, has felt satisfied? And you wouldn't know that unless you're having open and honest conversations with her. So that's where, well, men as well, we need to be having these conversations or listening to what women are saying, because if a woman doesn't feel emotionally safe in the bedroom, you shouldn't touch her. Physically, I'm saying. Yeah, I think this is where legislators, religious scholars, they need to be more in tune with women's issues. And they need, because I think if this was men that was complaining about molestation or rape, they would have done something about it. The same way I always say to people, even nowadays, even in conservative Muslim and Arabic speaking countries, so they're more interested in issues that affect men directly. That's why they'll talk about it. They'll talk about male masturbation, but they won't speak about female masturbation, because it's something that either they're uncomfortable with, they're unfamiliar with, they haven't even taken the time to understand or listen to women who are talking about these issues. So it needs to be a case of where such conversations are normalized. But ultimately, it does have to come with, especially when you're speaking about, like you mentioned, Morocco and other countries where it's not in the law, there needs to be pressure, like public pressure being put on legislators, on like scholars, people of authority, because at the end of the day, and we're both men, but generally speaking as men, unfortunately, I know this can be quite difficult for women to hear, but generally men only listen to other men they respect. A lot of men do not listen to women. So that's why there has to be more men that are speaking up and about these things. And it has to be men that they respect, because there's a number of men who've heard these things from women, but they pay them no attention. And again, how you change ethics, how you change morality, it comes from the culture. So there's a lot of things the culture needs to change. And when people talk about the culture, so in order to change it, the more conversations need to be had from different people, because like I said, if it's all only women speaking about it, it's not really going to change. And this is one of the unfortunate things when we speak about orgasm gap, sexual consent, a lot of these matters, a lot of women have been speaking about it for many years, but men aren't listening. It's only when men start to listen, that's when I think real change will kind of take place, if I'm honest.
Amen. Okay, so what I read in all your books is the importance also of pleasure-positive sex education, right? The fact that nothing should fall into the area of taboos before being thoroughly thought through with poise and consent. So how will we save Muslim people from their alleged prudishness, as you said before, and from saying haram whenever, although it might not even be? So what will it take for Muslims around the world to be more sex positive, or at least sex educated?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, although I believe Islam is a sex positive religion, although I believe it's a sexually enlightened religion, although I believe that it empowers both men and women to embrace their sensuality and sexuality, I also am aware that it's okay if someone is a prude, or it's okay if someone is quite uncomfortable with discussing these matters. And it's not really a case of shoving this information or to try and make people be as comfortable as maybe I am in discussing these issues, because everyone has got their different tolerance levels, and I think it should be respected. I think one of the unfortunate things, especially amongst people considered to be, religious or Muslim, is that the only people that seem to be allowed to talk about it is in a small section of it's prude and it's aib, where there's people that are conscious, that are Muslim, but are comfortable talking about sexuality and are comfortable embracing it and are comfortable listening or learning about sex in a sex positive manner. So I'm saying they both can go hand in hand, and that's the only thing I'm trying to, if not change, is that allow space for other people who are Muslim as well, maybe from a similar culture, but they don't have these same grips or these worries that other people do. And I'm not going to pretend or say that all of the Muslims in early Islam were very comfortable talking. There were some that were very reserved, and that's fine. So there's some people that are really reserved, and there's some people that are more open. And I'm saying it's fine that there are people that are reserved, but I think it's important that space is created for people who want to learn about sex in a sex positive way, in a pleasure positive way, in a way that is, it's inclusive and is one that embraces both men and women's sexuality. If someone is reserved, if someone wants to have even the terms when people talk about like vanilla sex, if that's all they want to do and they're comfortable with that and they're content and they're satisfied, that's fine. So even coming to your earlier question, when you was asking about sexual satisfaction, and because people now, they look at it as if in order to be sexually satisfied or sexually liberated, you need to have numerous sexual partners. You need to have these different sexual adventures. I disagree with that. You can be having, whether you want to call it vanilla, boring sex. I don't like to say boring, but vanilla sex with one sexual partner, and you're monogamous and that's all you want to do. If you're satisfied, you're just as liberated as the next person that's got doing X, Y, and Z. So that's why I just think, even the way we frame things, because I think the topic or the title sex positivity, that has been hijacked by some people. Sex positivity is something that obviously includes consent. It's something that someone takes ownership of their sexuality. And if someone wants to do that within the confines of their religious beliefs, that's fine. And it doesn't mean that they need to adopt like a Western standard, totally liberal, hedonistic version of sex positivity, because it can mean different things to different people.
We're going to wrap this up, but first, in every single episode of JINS, we debunk a myth that I've been told or that I've often heard of. So there's this Muslim woman who's been married for like 25 years who told me one day, son, I'm 50 years old now. Women my age are out of date. I had beautiful children, but sex isn't part of the game anymore. Sometimes I wish my husband would rekindle the flame, but life. Walhamdulillah. What would you have answered if you were me?
Well, I would say first and foremost, you're not out of date. Just because you're 50, that doesn't mean you're expired, and doesn't mean that you cannot enjoy and experience pleasure. And I'm using the word pleasure as opposed to sex. Yes, of course, in order to have children, you need to have sex, but you can have sex without having pleasure. So that's why it's important for the woman or any woman like that to reconnect with her body, reconnect with her desire, and obviously reconnect with her husband. And obviously, first and foremost, she has to understand that she's entitled to sexual pleasure, not necessarily just sex. Now, if we're talking about sexual enjoyment, the same way no one says, oh, I've had food for X amount of years, I'm tired of food, I don't need to eat anymore. Because generally, there's different types of food that's pleasurable. And the same way with sex, there is sex that is not pleasurable, and there's sex that's very pleasurable. Now, if it's pleasurable, of course, you're going to want to have more and more of it. And there's a lot of women who talk about their sex drive increases past 40. So just because you're of a certain age, it doesn't mean you're out of date, or because you've had children. And this is another one of the things that, unfortunately, and it does happen a lot in the Muslim world, that when women become mothers, they lose their sexual and erotic self. So their identity is that one of a mother and not of a sexual being, or not of an erotic being. And even sometimes men, they just view women as just the vessel that's going to bring forth my children, and not a vessel of pleasure and a person that is desirous of pleasure. It's about, again, reframing that mindset her understanding that she is entitled to sexual pleasure, not just sex itself, and then reconnecting not only with herself and her body, but also reconnecting with her spouse.
But then, even if she doesn't have a spouse, or like, I know that so many women have been insulted and said to be whores just because they wanted to have pleasure with their husbands, or even with when they remarry, or like this
Muslim countries, unfortunately, even if a woman initiates sex, or even if she's dressed a certain way, she may be called a whore. Now, Islamically, that is haram, haram, haram. Islamically, no, you cannot do that. Now, we know in some cultures that's the norm. That's ardi. That's not a problem. If a woman's dressed a certain way, she is a zania. She's the worst of the worst. She's a baghia. Now, Islamically, that's clearly incorrect, that behavior, and for someone to call a woman that. Now, in terms of the culture, it's going to take maybe a generation or two to change that, because unfortunately, men do have this attitude, and even there are a number of men, unfortunately, who, even if their wife were to initiate sex, they will think she's a whore, because where did you learn this information? There's no easy answer to change or fix the way a lot of men, unfortunately, how they view women. But if she herself doesn't think that about herself, that's the most important thing, because a lot of women, unfortunately, because of the social conditioning and what they've heard, they internalize this. So they think, if I initiate sex, even with my husband, I'm a whore. You can't change what someone thinks about you, but you can change how you think about yourself. So that's the first thing I would say. But I know it's easy for me to say because I'm a man. But I think the first and foremost, women need to first understand for themselves, and then try and find obviously someone who they can live and be their authentic self with. That's the next step.
Okay, Habeeb, that was so enlightening. Thank you so much for all the answers. It was incredibly interesting. Thank you.
No worries. Thank you for having me, Jamal. Shukran.
So before leaving you folks, a few things to remember. 1. Based upon traditional African and Arab values of manliness, there might be ways for African and Arab men to better know how to make love and satisfy a woman's emotional and physical desires. But there are men who desire women of particular skin colors and ethnic backgrounds. There are also white men who don't respect consent. There are also men who fetishize Muslim, brown, or black women. So, beware, beware. 2. Women who experienced fulfilled sexual lives have long existed in Islam, but their stories are often untold. Female sex experts and pleasure-positive Muslim women were often cited in erotic Arabic literature dating back to the 9th century. According to early African and Arab writers, women have a greater capacity for desire and pleasure than men. The medieval manuals emphasized the physical needs of women and the importance of emotional intimacy for a fulfilling marital relationship. Otherwise, they can divorce the man. Remember, you'll find all the aforesaid references in the description below, as I did every single time during season 1. For the most curious minds among you, I'll put a few book and film recommendations linked to today's topic, be it on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Google Podcasts, Deezer, or else. Don't forget to subscribe to JINS Podcast account and to leave your questions and comments. Go subscribe to JINS Podcast on Instagram at JINS_podcast. Don't hesitate to share around every time you listen to an episode, because you should always remember that someone, somewhere, somewhat needs a new light shed on Islam, gender identity, sexualities, Arab origins, or anything that can be prone to oppression. So please do your part and pass the word around. See you next week.